You've stepped into History Bound, where we saddle up and ride straight into the past. No shortcuts, no whitewash, just the trail as it truly ran from the folks who walked it. Most folks nowadays don't recollect much past their own doorstep, and fewer still know what real grit looks like when it's stripped down to hide, heart, and bone. But I've ridden enough hard miles under hot suns and cold moons to recognize backbone when I see it, and the tale of the Abernathy Boys holds as much backbone as any yarn I've ever come across. It's a story old as the frontier itself. Two young'uns riding out into a land that had no time for the weak, no patience for the helpless, and no mercy for the foolhardy. But that was all right with them boys. They were Abernathys, and they'd been raised to stand straight in a wind that could blow men sideways. Now you sit quiet a spell, and I'll lay it out for you the way a preacher would tell it. Plain, honest, and without embroidery. A tale like this don't need polish. It's pure enough as it is. Temple Abernathy wasn't yet big enough to carry a full saddle on his own shoulders when his brother Bud shook him awake that morning. Dawn hadn't so much as opened an eye. The air was slow and cool, the kind of gray stillness you get just before the world remembers it's supposed to move again. Bud was 9 years old, but he carried himself with that quiet, forward lean you only find in men who've known work all their lives and never complained of it. He wasn't big, but he had that long, tough feel to him, like a hickory switch of a boy, limber but hard to break. "Get up, Temp," Bud said, giving him a nudge with his toe. "We're riding to Santa Fe." And that was that. No speeches, no fuss, no second thoughts. In them days, a boy didn't ask 100 questions before he moved. He heard what needed doing, nodded once, and went about it. And little Temple, 5 years old and light as a dry mesquite limb, crawled out from under his covers without so much as a yawn. Santa Fe lay 500 and some miles off, across country that could turn a grown man into dust without losing pace. There were long, empty miles of Oklahoma territory and New Mexico stretched out between their small place and that faraway town where adobe walls baked under a fierce desert sun. The land out there didn't much care for travelers, and what few men rode through it tended to go in packs, rifles handy and eyes sharp. But the Abernathy boys weren't men, not yet. They were a pair of colts, one not long weaned, and still their father, Jack Abernathy, stood out by the corral gate, watching his sons pack their gear like they were setting out on no more than a morning errand. Jack wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. He didn't have to. Folks knew of him clear across the territory. They called him Catch 'em Alive Jack, on account of the wolves he'd pull off the range bare-handed, quick as a striking hawk. There was iron in the man, and flint too, but under it all, steady warmth enough to temper the boys he was raising. When he let Bud and Temple climb into their saddles that day, it wasn't carelessness nor neglect that loosened his grip. It was trust. And trust is a rarer thing than silver. Most men nowadays can't let their children walk the length of a grocery aisle without losing breath. But Jack Abernathy watched them tighten cinches, check canteens, and knot their bedrolls with fingers still small as sparrows' claws. When everything was ready, he stepped forward and laid one big weathered hand on each young shoulder. "You mind the land," he told him. "It don't forgive ignorance. but it don't begrudge courage neither. Temple nodded, solemn, proud, and too young to understand the weight in his father's voice. Bud only squared his jaw. And they rode. Temple was too small to ride long in the saddle in the usual way, so Jack had rigged him a traveling basket, a stout contraption lashed secure to the side of Bud's saddle. It weren't meant for comfort, but comfort is a fool's notion on the trail anyhow. What mattered was that it held him safe while the horses carried them across the flat and rolling stretches of country that seemed to run on forever. They rode through heat that shimmered like hammered brass. They rode through cold nights where frost formed on Temple's blanket before his breath had time to settle. They crossed rivers swollen from faraway rains, waters quick enough to take a grown man under without so much as a splash. But Bud handled his little brother like a man handles something worth more than his own life. He read maps like other boys read dime novels. He knew the shape of hills, the meaning of sky color, the way dust settles before a storm. The rifle he carried was nearly too big for him, but he held it steady. And though he was only 9, trouble knew enough to give him distance. Out in the desert nights, wolves sang their long, hungry songs. There were drifters, too, men with ragged coats and sly eyes watching from mesquite shadows. But 2 boys riding calm and quiet, never flinching nor hurrying, looked too sure of themselves to be easy pickings. Sometimes the trail gives trouble pause, simply because those walking it don't look willing to bow. Weeks later, when they reached Santa Fe, folks stared like they were seeing ghost riders or tall tales come alive. 2 dust-covered boys, sunburnt to rawhide, clothes rubbed thin from saddle wear, yet whole, upright, and steady-eyed. Temple grinned. Bud nodded once, polite but unshaken. They'd done it, 500 miles out. And then they turned around and rode home. 1,000 miles, give or take a few hoof steps. Temple was 5 for near all of it. You'd think that kind of journey would take the fire out of a boy, or at least bank it for a time. But the Abernathys weren't the sort to cool easy. They were young yet, but they had tasted the flavor of the frontier. And once a boy knows that taste, it's hard to settle again. In 1910, the next year by the calendar, Bud was 10 and Temple 6 when they fixed their minds on New York City. New York weren't just far. It was another world. 1,500 miles of changing country lay between Oklahoma and that far-off place of noise and stone, a land full of strangers and machines and tall buildings that leaned against the sky like stacked lumber. But those boys saddled up again, packed their gear neat and tight, and rode. They passed through towns where folks gaped and offered them food out of sheer admiration or worry. It was sometimes hard to tell which. Policemen tried stopping them in the bigger cities, certain they were runaways in need of a belt strap and a train ride home. But the boys had the right papers from their father, and more important, they had that same steady look that kept dumb questions from reaching their ears. They slept under stars when the land allowed it, and under barn roofs when storms pushed them seeking shelter. Some mornings they woke with frost on their blankets, other mornings with dust in their teeth from rough miles the day before. And after a month of trail days and long nights, they rode into New York City on 2 worn, trail-weary horses. The city swallowed them whole, great crowds, shouting vendors, whistling trains, but through it all, Bud sat tall in the saddle, Temple perched behind him with wide eyes and a grin so bright it could shame sunrise. Newspapers took their story and flung it across the country. The Abernathy Boys, they called them, like a pair of dime novel heroes. But Bud and Temple weren't finished. Not by half. By 1911, they were planning something bigger, something larger than any ordinary man, let alone a pair of boys, had any business attempting. Near 4,000 miles, coast to coast, mountains that bite deep into the sky, deserts that can kill a man without raising a sweat, plains that stretch farther than an honest eye can see. Bud was 11. Temple was 7. Some grown men spend their whole lives circling the same 20 miles of ground, never knowing what lies beyond the next ridge. But Bud and Temple Abernathy were built from sterner lumber. They saw the width of the continent laid out before them and reckoned it'd make a fine road. So they rode. 62 days of sun, storm, grit, and long shadow mornings. They crossed the Appalachians, rolled down into the wide belly of the Great Plains, climbed the Rockies where the air thins and a man feels small under the blue, then dropped into deserts that glisten like the hammered blade of a hot knife. They got lost, sure. Every real traveler does. They ran short on food. Horses went lame. Bud's hands blistered and cracked from miles of rope and rain, and Temple's little legs cramped from riding double more often than not. But they never once turned back. And when they finally rode down out of the Nevada barrens and into San Francisco, a pair of children small enough to go unnoticed in a crowd, they'd done what most grown men wouldn't dare. The whole sweeping span of America. 3,619 miles, 2 months, Bud 11, Temple 7, and they made it look almost easy. Some boys, when they grow past a certain point, settle into the calm ruts of life. Not the Abernathys. The world was changing, machines rising like great iron beasts, gasoline engines barking along new roads. And Bud, 13 now, wasn't about to let the modern age ride past him without grabbing the reins. In 1913, Bud and Temple climbed aboard an Indian motorcycle, a roaring, powerful machine that could race past any horse on the plains. No escort, no backup wagon. Just 2 boys, a rattling engine, and the open country running out before them. They tore across the continent again, this time on wheels. By then, newspapers trailed their story like dust behind a herd. Crowds gathered wherever the boys stopped. Folks wanted to touch the motorcycle, to shake the boys' hands, to say they'd seen the Abernathy brothers with their own eyes. They'd become something rare, symbols of a fading America, the last breath of the open frontier pressed into the small shoulders of 2 unstoppable boys.
People asked Jack Abernathy how he could let his sons wander the width of the country with nothing but horses, maps, and their own good sense. He'd look at them calm as a winter sunrise. "I reckon a boy becomes a man by meeting the world," he'd say, "not by hiding from it." Their mother had died young, leaving Jack to raise his sons with a clear understanding that the world would not wait on them, nor soften itself for their sake. He wasn't cruel, just honest. And a frontier father's honesty is often mistaken for hardness by the tender-hearted. Bud and Temple didn't ride to prove anything to the world. They rode because it was there. Because they had the legs and the horses and the will. Because when the frontier was slipping away like water through a split canteen, they wanted to taste it while they still could. And taste it they did. Years rolled on. Horses gave way to automobiles, dust trails turned into paved roads, and the kind of land that once tested a man's marrow became shopping districts and quiet neighborhoods. The boys grew into men with steady hands and long memories, knowing they'd seen the last of something the world would never get back. Bud lived to 1979, passing at 79 years old. Temple followed in 1986, 82 years behind him. Both saw a nation changed from end to end, saw highways stitched across plains they once crossed on horseback, saw machines do in hours what had taken them months. But nothing, not one thing this world built after them, could match the straight-cut courage of the miles they'd ridden when they were scarcely bigger than the rifles they carried. Nowadays, a pair of boys riding out alone would have lawmen, caseworkers, and half the county chasing them before they hit the first crossroads. Folks would call it reckless, irresponsible, foolhardy. Maybe they'd be right by today's reckonings. But Bud and Temple Abernathy weren't born to today. They rode in a time made of tougher fiber, when a boy might carry grown man responsibilities without complaint, and when the world expected a child to rise rather than sit quiet. They were 5 and 9 on their first 1,000-mile ride, 7 and 11 when they crossed the whole wide country. Just boys, yet braver, steadier, and more determined than many a man twice their years. The Abernathy brothers proved something the world has near forgotten, that grit ain't measured in age, that courage ain't weighed by size, and that a heart determined to do a thing is a force no map nor mile can stop. Temple was 5 when he rode through a land that broke strong men and left their bones bleaching under the open sky. 5, and he came home smiling. So the next time somebody tells you what a child can't do, remember Bud and Temple Abernathy, 2 boys who rode the frontier while it still breathed, and proved the impossible was nothing more than a trail waiting to be traveled.